A pretty interesting and exciting topic that I've been wanting to do a meetup about for a while now. And just I'll start out by saying, as a modern social movement, we have the opportunity to learn from hundreds of past movements and movements that have existed for various causes, movements that have succeeded and that have failed. And there is just so much documented history about this that we can really take advantage of as a movement in 2021. And I think it's really important that we spend time trying to learn from the successes and failures of past movements. I think that a lot of the time, as the animal rights movement, we don't see ourselves as a traditional social justice movement, just like so many that have come before us. But when we spend time looking at movements like the civil rights movement, like the gay marriage and the marriage equality movement, and like the movement against child labor in the United States, we see so many parallels. We see the same struggles happening over and over of activist retention and of police repression. And it really helps us to realize that we are part of this extremely long historic tradition of people pushing for change in society, and there's so much we can learn from them as well. So a couple months ago now, Almira and I undertook a project to dive into a few different movements that we thought had a lot of potential to parallel the modern animal rights movement very specifically. So we've done in the past, we've looked at a lot of movements, we've looked at a lot of meta-analyses of movements, but a lot of this has been focused around specific movements, and especially a lot of the modern research about nonviolent conflict and nonviolent uprisings are focused around regime change revolutions. So basically, there's a dictator or there's an authoritarian regime in your country. You want to create a revolution to kick them out of power and replace them. That's a very specific use case for nonviolent movements. And it's pretty different than what we're trying to do. I would argue that a lot of us want to do that as well, but as the modern animal rights movement, that's like not our primary focus. So the child labor movement stood out for a number of reasons. One, the movement was seeking a sweeping social reform and a change to or to create a specific kind of legislation, not to overthrow the government. The movement was fueled and run mostly by adult allies. Children were less able to advocate for themselves directly. So we see that parallel directly to the animal liberation movement. And child labor was both extremely normalized in society and made up an instrumental part of so many industries. It was really a backbone of many major economic powerhouses in the United States. So a lot of people said just logistically, we couldn't get rid of it. So those were some reasons we wanted to look at this movement. And as I dove into this, I saw more and more direct parallels, and there are some like kind of hilariously direct comparisons that I'll make here. But the big thing is we just want to kind of take a look at movements like this from as sober a perspective as possible. We don't want to be looking for necessarily confirmation bias that we're always doing the right thing. We want to learn really from what went well and what didn't, and that's never going to translate 100%. Circumstances are always going to be different. We live in a very different society now than we did in the 1800s, which is largely what I'm going to be talking about here. And also the issue is inherently different in a lot of ways. So I'll start out just with a little bit of history. In the 1800s, child labor was extremely normalized in the US. Most kids under 15 worked up to 14 hours a day, either alongside their parents or for an employer, unless they were the children of very rich families, in which case those families probably had other children working for them. And here you see young boys in a coal mine in West Virginia, basically you can see they're kind of on an incline slope, and coal is rushing down past them, and their job was to pick out rocks and stuff like that. And so for hours and hours and hours a day, up to 14 or more hours a day, these kids are sitting in some of the worst health conditions you can imagine, coal just being pushed right past them constantly, and they're having to pick out these rocks. Very dangerous job. Child labor, including the slavery of Black children, was extremely common in the cotton and coal mining industries, as well as many others. So, one thing we're not going to talk about a ton today is the fact that obviously in the 1800s, there was human slavery in the United States, slavery of African Americans, of Black people. And this is usually not talked about in the same way as the movement against child labor because they had kind of different solutions. It was usually, frankly, the movement against child labor was largely racist white people, and they weren't talking a lot about the slavery of Black children. But there were some parallels, and certainly that's another thing to be aware of here. And we'll talk a little bit about the timeline of that as well. So, children were used because they were cheap. They were able to fit in small places that adults just couldn't fit in. And they were also seen as much more obedient. It was a common phrase to say children don't strike. So the labor unions movement at the time is rising. Children, though, are not going to strike. And if they do, their parents want that money. Their parents are the ones sending them to work, and they'll be punished at home. So those are some of the reasons that children were used for labor so much. And my first takeaway today is about coalitions and allyship. Throughout the 1800s, most child advocacy was done actually by labor unions and consumer advocacy groups. Consumer advocacy groups, for those of you who don't know, are basically like it's essentially like a union for consumers, groups of consumers that would get together and say, we want to make sure that our products are going to be safe for our consumption. We want to make sure that our products are going to be, not contain huge amounts of poison, or in some cases, concerned about the labor that was going into their products and wanting that to be more fair. So interesting groups. But throughout the 1800s, it's thought of by historians as basically there was no specific movement against child labor. It was like an extra ask tacked on to labor unions striking and demands. So especially women-specific labor unions, they were doing a lot of the work in the 1800s. And they really did, as they would strike, they would make asks about child labor. They would pressure the Democratic Party and other politicians to take a position on child labor. And they really got a lot of progress done in the 1800s that way. And even though children rarely unionized, labor unions stood up for the rights of children and often included planks about child labor reforms in their demands. So they were really pushing them forward. Consumer advocacy groups also did a lot of this work. And yeah, so interesting thing is that they were able to take advantage of some of the largest movements at the time. I think it was 1836, the first ever labor union in the US was formed. At least that's how it's recognized today. And they were able to basically, even though children were not unionizing, here's a rare picture of children actually picketing. They were able to get support from these larger movements. The movement against child labor in the US was centered in Massachusetts, a progressive stronghold at the time, and many of the first victories of the child labor movement occurred right there in Massachusetts. So in 1836, Massachusetts passed a law mandating at least 3 months of school per year for so-called factory children. So you can see that was a massive win at the time. It was unprecedented to say children have to go to school at least 3 months a year. So very different than what we're dealing with now. And in 1842, they passed a law prohibiting children working more than 10 hours a day. So it sounds ridiculous to allow children to work 10 hours a day every day except for 3 months of the year. But that was the situation they were dealing with at the time. And as soon as Massachusetts passed this law in 1842, many other states followed quickly. So this is kind of something we see similar to the animal rights movement, where we're trying to focus on California and hoping that it spreads. Around the turn of the century, though, so entering 1900s, public sentiment on child labor had shifted. Laws had been passed around the country giving children more rights and putting restrictions on specific industries and specific practices. So they would say, the textile industry can't use children under this age for this purpose. So very what we would call now welfare reforms, lots of welfare reforms being passed. But despite the positive appearance, these laws were almost never enforced, and the industry was growing faster than ever. And in 1900, in the year 1900, it was estimated that children under 16 years old made up over 18% of the entire labor force in the United States. So this was a huge part. Almost 20% of all workers in the United States are under 16, and they're being used for a lot of the worst and most laborious jobs. So it had become clear at this point that a federal law was needed in order to hold states accountable and challenge the powerful industries that controlled local governments. And my second takeaway is that the failure of welfare reforms and the corruption of local enforcement cements the need for larger scale abolition. So welfare reforms are being passed around the country, but they're not working. They're not being enforced, and they're not making a difference in the way children are being treated, which proves to us in some ways similar to what we're seeing now with police reform in the United States, where badge cams are being used and different training is being used. Police are getting they're getting more de-escalation training. They're getting more inherent bias training, and it's not making a difference. Black people are still dying at massive rates at the hands of police, and that cements the need for abolition or for more drastic, larger scale reforms. So in 1904, the National Child Labor Committee took the mantle of forcing federal action. So you can see here, horrible picture, sorry, but these are women on strike in the late 1800s, and they're saying, we condemn child labor along with their other demands. So the NCLC, the National Child Labor Committee, took on the mantle of forcing federal action in 1904. This is one of their displays that they put up. And when I was looking through this, there were some pretty uncanny similarities that really drove this home for me. But so in 1908, the NCLC hired a photographer named Lewis Hine. And Lewis Hine pioneered the use of investigation to expose the reality of the industry. Almost all the photos of child labor that we've used today, and almost all of them that you can find from this period, were taken by Lewis Hine. So kind of funny. Often lying or sneaking his way into factories or taking photos from public property when necessary, these investigations completely reinvigorated the movement against child labor. And in one 1905 investigation, the NCLC focused in on the anthracite coal mining industry in Pennsylvania. And the government had essentially just claimed that they had been doing audits and they were enforcing local laws. And don't worry, the anthracite coal mining industry in Pennsylvania is using no more than 8,100 workers under the age of 16, and there were probably no more than 700 total workers under the age of 14. So the NCLC did this massive investigation, and they found over 12,000 children under the age of 14. So completely different than what the local government is saying, and this actually had a large impact. This was published in papers at the time around the country, and some of the actually, I believe this picture that I showed earlier is from the anthracite coal mining industry in the same time. And this investigation basically cemented the idea in the minds of the public that local laws, state laws, and these like slow welfare reforms were not making the difference because the local legislatures and local governments were not doing the investigations to actually know what was going on at all. Bam. So the investigation exposed how little oversight states' government were taking on the issue of child labor. And alongside of these investigations, the NCLC used leafleting. They did mass mailing. They distributed a lot through progressive newsletters. And at the time, socialist parties were springing up around the United States. And they did a lot of basically doing organizing and messaging through socialist parties at the time, because that was the major movement that was rising, and they really took good advantage of that. They also undertook sophisticated lobbying. So they would use these investigations and they would go right to the federal government and they would say, states are not doing what they need to do. What are you going to do about this? And they put a lot of pressure on the federal government that way. They worked closely with newly expanding socialist parties, and consumer advocacy groups worked on labeling laws that informed consumers about the practices going into everyday products. So this is kind of similar to some things we've talked about in DXE, where we talk about right to know. They pushed for, I actually wasn't able to find whether any of these laws passed, but it was a campaign that a lot of people put a lot of time into, basically asking for labels on every product about whether child labor was used. So that would both put pressure on the industry to be more transparent, put more pressure on local governments to actually do the investigation, and make consumers aware of what practices were going into everyday products. So my third takeaway, and you can yeah, okay. So my third takeaway is that this kind of change, social reform that occurs within a relatively stable society, unlike regime change, tends to take a long time, and it can involve a lot of failure. Not that regime change can't involve a lot of failure and take a long time, but so now we're talking about 1916, the first ever federal labor law, child labor law, has been passed. So only 16 years after the NCLC was formed, they passed their first ever federal law. But this law only lasted 2 years before it was found unconstitutional. And over the next 20 years, a fierce legal battle was fought over the ability of the federal government to regulate child labor. So almost a dozen laws were passed on the federal level and then were struck down in one way or another. So either they were found unconstitutional, they failed to be ratified by states, they were struck down by the next administration after they were passed by a progressive one. It was a fierce battle for the next 20 years in the court system, and this was all powered by those same movements, by the labor union organizing, by the NCLC doing these investigations, and they never let up. And along the time that, so now the federal government is going, they're trying to pass these laws, they're getting them struck down, they're passing another one struck down. The NCLC and the movement is also pressing for individual, smaller, incremental changes. So, for example, in 1936, they passed the Walsh-Healy Act, which made it essentially divestment, what we would call now divestment. So they made it illegal for the federal government to purchase products that were made with child labor. So I thought that was really interesting. And like, even as this large scale reform is happening, they're working on these smaller, they're trying to ban horse racing, essentially, even though this constitutional amendment is still happening. Like, they're trying to chip away at whatever they can get. And I thought that was great as well. And then in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, and for the first time, minimum ages of employment and hours for work for children were regulated by the federal government. And this is essentially seen as the win. So at this point, the movement kind of falls apart, and they're like, we got it. They pretty much got what they wanted. And at this point, like, the use of very young children in a lot of these industries basically goes goodbye. So this is seen as their major win, and there are still massive issues with child labor in the US and around the world, but this is really what they were pushing for. So you could take a fourth takeaway out of this is like, maybe don't give up so easily. But yeah, so that's basically the timeline I wanted to talk about today. And to reiterate, my 3 takeaways were building coalitions and allyship with the largest movements at the time, so we can think about what are the largest movements right now that we could build coalitions with, and I think a lot of those come to mind for us. The second one was, sorry, I just lost my notes here. The failure of welfare reforms and the corruption of local enforcement cements the need for larger abolition. And the third takeaway is that this kind of change can take a long time. It can take a lot of failure, and we need to stay with it. We need to not be deterred by failing, and we need to chip away at the smaller pieces. As anytime we have the opportunity, we need to create wins along the way to larger scale abolition. So I'll open it up, I guess, to questions. And I would love to hear also if anyone has other take